After the wedding, on our way home, my husband and I were involved in a car accident. The at-fault driver fled the scene. When I regained consciousness in the hospital, my world felt like it had crumbled. I was the sole survivor, my husband having tragically not made it. Weeks later, the driver responsible for the accident was apprehended. I believed the ordeal was over until their final statement, which brought everything to a standstill. The name they uttered left me frozen with shock. In that instant, I knew a fundamental part of my reality had just imploded. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. If this narrative resonates with you, please consider liking and subscribing to ensure you don't miss future installments. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments. A brief note: this is a work of fiction. Any names or locations you recognize are purely coincidental, but we hope the underlying message of this story will linger with you. Now, let us commence. The initial sensation I registered was a persistent mechanical beeping emanating from somewhere above me. This was followed by the smell of antiseptic and recycled air. I attempted to move, and pain flared from places I hadn't realized could ache. The ceiling was stark white and unadorned. I was in a hospital bed. My right hand felt foreign, heavy. I lifted it towards the light, and there it was. The ring. A simple gold band, still on my finger, still reflecting the light as it had the previous night when Cole placed it there, and it felt as though the entire room collectively exhaled. And just like that, the evening before flooded back. Forsyth Park had never appeared more magical than on that October night. White lights twinkled through the ancient oaks, golden leaves drifted across the pavilion, a beauty so profound it stole one's breath. Joelle stood waiting at the entrance. Without a word, she gently adjusted the edge of my veil, her hands remarkably steady. "Ready?" she inquired. "More than anything," I replied. My father was just beyond the entrance. Dorian Elspeth stood with his shoulders back, his expression composed, controlled, revealing nothing. He offered me his arm, and I took it. Yet, as the music swelled and every face turned towards us, his gaze was not on me. It was fixed somewhere beyond, as if a private tempest raged within him, one he hadn't invited me into. I dismissed it as the weight of the occasion. I clung to that belief because it was easier than the alternative. Then I saw Cole, and the entire world condensed into a single point. He stood at the altar, his hands loosely clasped before him. The moment our eyes met, something in his expression became utterly still. It wasn't the stillness of restraint, but of arrival. My chest tightened, and it had nothing to do with my dress. Cole Beaumont had known me my entire life. Our mothers, Vera Voss and Adele Bancroft, had been inseparable friends since college, quietly harboring the hope for years that their children might find each other. I lost my mother at 8. Adele never let me forget Vera's presence, keeping her photograph on the mantel, speaking her name aloud in rooms where silence had settled. It was the greatest kindness anyone ever showed me. Adele was in the front row at the altar, a handkerchief pressed to each eye. Sutton sat beside her, Cole's father, broad and still, exuding a steadiness that was the most substantial element in any room. His jaw was tight. His eyes were exceptionally bright. I understood that this was the manifestation of his deep emotion. During our first dance, Cole drew me close and lowered his voice. He told me that years ago, on a day I wasn't aware of his presence, he had visited my mother's grave. He had made her a promise. If I ever became his, he would ensure every single day that I knew I was safe, that I was chosen. I pressed my face against his shoulder, thinking of Vera, wondering if she could somehow know that her deepest hope had been realized. I chose to believe she did. The remainder of the evening was filled with warmth and joy, and it ended far too soon. We exchanged our farewells late as the park grew cool and quiet, and Cole assisted me into the car with an effortless care that felt as though it had always been there. We drove east on Highway 80 towards the coast. The city lights receded behind us. Cole reached across the center console without looking, and his hand found mine in the darkness. I closed my eyes. I was completely, peacefully present in that car, on that road, with that man, on the final perfect night of the life I had always known. I remained there as the headlights appeared. Approaching from the opposite lane, blindingly white, impossibly wide, and rapidly closing in. The horn blared, splitting the night with a long, terrible sound, and the world I inhabited shattered into 1,000 pieces in a single, catastrophic second. I have no recollection of the impact itself. What I know of that night, beyond the moment of collision, I slowly pieced together from Joelle's account, from what Adele shared in the days that followed, and from the investigators' reports I read later when I was strong enough to hold them. I was unconscious for most of it. What I am about to recount is the framework of those hours as I eventually came to comprehend them, not as I experienced them. What I recall is the sound, a tearing, grinding roar that consumed everything, and then a sensation akin to the floor dropping out from beneath the entire world. There was glass. There was a violent stillness that felt more harrowing than the noise, and then there was nothing at all. What transpired in the minutes that followed I could only reconstruct much later. The driver did not stop. I would eventually learn this through investigators, testimony, and the slow, painful reconstruction of a night from which I had been absent. Whoever was behind the wheel fled the wreckage, vanishing into the darkness of Highway 80, leaving behind only twisted metal, silence, and the two of us within it. It was another motorist, traveling in the opposite direction, who discovered the scene and alerted authorities. Emergency services arrived within minutes. To everyone who responded that night, it appeared precisely as it was intended to look: a terrible, random accident on a dark coastal road. They had no inkling then that it had been orchestrated. Sutton Beaumont received the call just before midnight. He and Adele had only been home for an hour, still warmed by the reception, still bathed in the glow of an evening that, by all measures, had felt exactly as it should. Adele later told me that she sensed trouble the moment the phone rang. Not the specifics, not the words, but the feeling. That familiar sinking sensation in the pit of the stomach that precedes understanding, when the body grasps what the mind is still refusing. They reached Memorial Health University Medical Center before the hour was up. Dorian arrived sometime later, pale and composed, navigating the corridor with his hands in his pockets and a carefully arranged expression on his face. He found a chair in the corner of the waiting room and remained there, saying little to anyone and asking few questions. Adele recounted this to me later, and I absorbed it, filing it away in the part of my mind that was still too fragile to examine directly. I don't know how long I was gone. Returning was a gradual process, like ascending through deep water, the weight slowly easing, a lightness finding me from somewhere far above. The beeping arrived first, steady and mechanical, the same sound that would punctuate my awakenings in the days to come. Then the ceiling, white and blank, offering no comfort whatsoever. Then the pain, which struck all at once, stealing my breath. I turned my head carefully. The room was dim. Tubes snaked from my arm to a monitor beside the bed. The window revealed a deep Georgian sky, that distinctive shade of blue that appears in the hours before dawn, when night has not yet fully conceded today. And in the chair closest to me, her head lolling forward, hands folded in her lap, was Joelle, asleep as people sleep when they refuse to go home. I attempted to speak. What emerged was barely a sound. It was enough. Joelle's head snapped up immediately. Her eyes met mine, and two emotions crossed her face simultaneously: relief and something else. Something heavier. something she was desperately trying to conceal. She reached out and touched my arm with a gentleness that conveyed more than she intended. "Hey," she whispered. "I'm right here." I looked past her. Adele stood near the window, still in the dress she had worn to the wedding, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Sutton stood beside her, a still, imposing figure, his back rigid, his jaw set, his gaze fixed on the floor. He appeared as a man bearing an immense burden, utterly immobile, as any movement, even an inch, might cause it all to collapse. My father was in the corner, elbows on his knees, his gaze lost somewhere beyond the room's confines. An unnamed presence hung in the air of that room, impossible to ignore. "Cole," I said. No one moved. No one responded. Joelle's hand tightened on my arm. "Cole." Louder this time, and in my own voice, I heard the subtle tremor begin, the word bending slightly at the end, as if already bracing for what was to come. Adele crossed the room, slowly, each step requiring a deliberate decision. She sat on the edge of my bed, her hands clasping both of mine. Instantly, I felt them trembling. Adele, who had maintained an iron composure through everything I had ever witnessed, whose unwavering stability had been a constant I relied upon without ever explicitly acknowledging it, her hands were shaking in mine. I looked at her face, and I already knew. The body comprehends certain truths before the mind is willing to accept them. A cold, absolute certainty had taken root in my chest, settling there, heavy and immutable, long before she uttered a single word. "Sarah, sweetheart." My name faltered on her voice. "No," I said, my tone quiet, flat. It was the most futile word I had ever uttered. "Cole didn't make it, sweetheart." The room remained unchanged. The monitors maintained their steady rhythm. The window retained its darkness. Sutton didn't move. My father didn't look up. Everything in that room stayed precisely, cruelly in place. I was the only element within it that had completely fragmented. No one tells you that grief is largely a process of waiting. Waiting for the pain to transmute into something you can navigate. Waiting for the hours to tick by. Waiting to feel like your old self again, while a part of you already suspects that the person you're waiting for no longer exists. The hospital days blurred into one another, as days tend to do when there's nothing to differentiate them, save for the changing light through the window. Morning, afternoon, evening, the same incessant beeping, the same uninspiring ceiling, the same dull ache that resided behind my sternum, never fully relinquishing its hold. People came. They always do, in the beginning. They brought flowers, food, and words, intended to comfort but which failed to do so. They uttered platitudes like, "Everything happens for a reason," "He's in a better place," and "Time heals." These might hold truth in the long run, but they offer no solace when you are only 4 days removed from losing the person around whom you had constructed your entire future. I listened to it all with a neutral expression, offered a polite "thank you," and meant none of it. And I believe most of them understood, yet came anyway, because that is what one does. Joelle spoke very little. That was how I knew she truly understood. She slept in the chair beside my bed every single night without being asked, without making it a point of discussion, without ever suggesting she needed to return to her own home and her own bed. She was simply there when I closed my eyes and there when I opened them. And in those initial agonizing days, that was the most invaluable gift anyone offered me. My father visited every afternoon. He would arrive, inquire about my well-being, settle into the chair by the window, and remain there, gazing out at whatever expanse of Savannah sky the window offered. He was not a man of many words, but this was different. This was a silence imbued with a palpable texture. A silence that seemed to be deliberately striving to be nothing more than silence. I was too hollowed out to attempt to break it. I simply let him sit there, staring at the sky, telling myself that people grieve differently and that this was his way. Renata and Iris arrived on the third day. Renata swept into the room ahead of her daughter, already emitting loud, gasping sobs that filled every corner of the space and drew the attention of a nurse in the corridor. She took my hands and declared how deeply sorry she was, expressing disbelief, lamenting how cruel and unfair life was. She conveyed all of this with an apparent sincerity that seemed entirely genuine. I had no reason then to suspect otherwise. Iris stood behind her mother near the door. She was dry-eyed, utterly still, her hands loosely clasped before her. Her face was composed into an expression that mimicked grief. Much like a photograph resembles a living being, technically accurate, yet entirely missing the essence. She met my eyes briefly and offered her condolences in a voice that was perfectly even. Then she looked away. I rationalized that she was simply someone who did not express emotions easily. Some people are like that. I had grown up with one such individual at our dinner table. I filed it away and let it go, having no emotional reserves left for anything beyond bare survival. Bette Sinclair visited on the fourth day. She had worked for our family for as long as I could remember, packing my school lunches and ironing my father's shirts, moving through our house with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that the best service is the kind that goes unnoticed. She was 60 years old and had never, in all the time I had known her, made anything about herself. She entered the room without ceremony, placed a small bundle of sweet olive branches on the bedside table, the kind that grew along the back fence of the Elspeth property, the same ones my mother had cherished, and sat down in the chair beside me. She took my hand in both of hers and held it. She did not speak. She offered no explanations, no comfort, no philosophy. She simply held on with the firm grip of someone who has witnessed enough of life to know that sometimes, simply holding on is all that is needed. She stayed for 40 minutes. As she finally stood to leave, she paused at the door and looked back at me with an expression I was incapable of deciphering at that moment. It was something weighted and deliberate, like a person carrying something fragile over a great distance, striving intently not to reveal its presence. Then Iris passed her in the doorway, leaving ahead of Renata, and I watched as Bette's eyes followed my stepsister down the corridor. Whatever emotion flickered across Bette's face in that moment was not grief. It was not sympathy. It possessed an older, quieter, and considerably more serious quality, vanishing the instant she turned back, offered me a small, composed nod, and walked away. I was too shattered to analyze it. I let it go. On the sixth night, long after visiting hours had concluded and the corridor outside had fallen silent, I heard Sutton's voice through the door's gap, low and deliberate. He was speaking to Adele in that particular manner he used when a decision had been made, and he was merely informing her of the fact. "Something about this doesn't sit right," he stated. "It hasn't from the beginning." I heard Adele inquire what he meant. He didn't answer her directly. Instead, sometime in the deep quiet of 2 a.m., I heard him step into the corridor and press the phone to his ear. "Silas." His voice was calm and absolute. "I need you in Savannah tonight." He arrived on a Tuesday morning, 7 days after the wedding. I was seated on the back porch of the Beaumont house on Bull Street when Sutton came to fetch me, still in yesterday's attire, a cup of coffee gone cold on the railing beside me, observing the way the light filtered through the old oak at the yard's edge. I had been discharged from the hospital 2 days prior and had come here at Adele's request, and because returning to the apartment Cole and I had been planning to share felt like something I wasn't yet capable of enduring. Sutton mentioned he wanted me to meet someone. The man waiting in the front sitting room didn't make a strong impression at first glance. Silas Becker was somewhere in his late 40s, lean and unhurried, with a face that revealed very little and eyes that were actively engaged, doing considerably more work than they outwardly suggested. He was dressed plainly. He rose when I entered and shook my hand with a brevity I appreciated. No lingering, no pitying expression, no careful adjustment of his features to signal understanding of the difficulty. He simply shook my hand and waited. Sutton explained who he was: a private investigator, someone with whom he had previously collaborated and whom he trusted implicitly, someone he had summoned because certain aspects of the accident's night had not sat well with him, and he intended to uncover the reason why. I looked at Silas, then at Sutton. "I want to be involved in this," I declared. Sutton began to offer a measured, protective remark, the kind of thing people say when trying to shield you from something. I didn't allow him to finish. "He was my husband," I stated. "Whatever happened on that road happened to me too. This is my fight as much as it is yours." There was a pause. Sutton regarded me for a long moment with an expression I couldn't fully decipher. Then, he nodded once, and that was the end of it. Silas walked us through his findings thus far. The truck that had collided with our vehicle was registered to a company, a freight logistics operation, with an address in another state. Upon verifying the registration, he discovered the company had been dissolved nearly 3 years prior. The dissolution paperwork was minimal and irregular. The entire setup bore the hallmarks of something constructed for a single use and then quietly vanished. I posed questions. I inquired about the state of incorporation, whether there were named officers on record, and how a deregistered company could still possess a valid vehicle registration. Silas answered each one directly and without condescension, which revealed something about him. By the conclusion of the briefing, I had filled 3 pages of a legal pad with notes in my own handwriting. That evening, alone in the guest room Adele had prepared for me, I opened my laptop and began my search. Public business registration databases, state filing records, freight corridor maps for the southeastern seaboard. I was looking for any overlap, any connection between the dissolved company's registered state and the type of route that would bring a truck onto Highway 80 on a Saturday night in October. I found nothing conclusive. The threads I pulled led nowhere I could follow independently, but I meticulously recorded everything. Every dead end, every partial match, every unresolved question raised by the search. I wrote it all down on the same legal pad and presented it to Silas the following morning, before he had finished his first cup of coffee. He perused my notes without speaking, turning each page carefully, dismissing not a single line. It was also that morning that Detective Sam Whitaker from the Savannah Police Department visited the house. He was 40 years old, steady and precise, characteristic of someone who had learned to navigate spaces where people were grieving with careful consideration. He had been reviewing the crash site report and had identified several details that did not align with a standard roadway collision: the angle of impact, the speed indicated by the damage pattern, and the absence of any braking evidence from the truck prior to impact. "We're treating this as an open investigation," he informed Sutton in a tone that was professional without being cold. "I want to be straightforward with you about where we stand." I appreciated that he addressed both of us. By the end of that second day, the shape of something was beginning to emerge. Not clearly, not with any certainty, but with the distinct weight of a reality that is tangible even before it can be proven. Silas sat across from me at the kitchen table that evening and stated it plainly. "This was not an accident," he said. "The evidence points to something deliberate, something arranged." The word "arranged" settled in the room and lingered. I had been contemplating a detail since the previous day's briefing, something that had lodged itself in my mind and refused to let go. I thought about the route Cole and I had taken, Highway 80 east toward Tybee Island. It wasn't the most direct path home from Forsyth Park. It was the scenic route, the one Cole always favored, the one we had driven together a dozen times. No one outside our closest circle would have known we would choose it that night. I looked at Silas across the table. Planned by someone who knew our exact route, I said. He looked at me for a moment. Then he looked down at the legal pad of notes I had given him that morning, still open on the table between us. He did not dismiss my statement. He picked up his pen and wrote something down. Moving into the Beaumont house on Bull Street was not a decision I consciously made. It was rather something that simply happened, as certain things do in the wake of catastrophe. Not precisely chosen, but accepted because the alternative demanded more of myself than I currently possessed. Adele had prepared the guest room without being asked. Fresh linens, a lamp on the nightstand, a glass of water. These were the small, practical kindnesses of a woman who understood that what I needed most was not to be fussed over, but simply a place to rest my feet that felt secure. I was not resting. I want to be clear about that. Every morning, I was at the kitchen table with my legal pad and my notes, and whatever Silas had shared the previous day, working through the timeline much like one tackles a problem one is determined to solve. But I was also observing. Silas had told me that the person who arranged the crash knew our exact route that night. That knowledge now resided within me like a splinter. Specific, located, impossible to ignore its constant pressure. My father visited on the third afternoon. He arrived with coffee from a place on Drayton Street, a gesture entirely characteristic of him, thoughtful in its small, practical way, without demanding anything in return. We sat on the back porch and he inquired about the investigation in that careful, peripheral manner of someone who wishes to appear interested without approaching the core of a matter. Each time I introduced Silas's name into the conversation, each time I mentioned the truck registration, the shell company, or the camera footage, Dorian shifted. Not drastically, not in a way I could have pinpointed and named. He would steer the conversation to the garden, to something Adele had said, or to a memory of Cole that was entirely genuine yet completely beside the point. I watched his hands as he spoke. I wrote it down afterward. Dorian would change the subject whenever the investigation was mentioned, his eyes darting left, his grip tightening on his mug. I didn't yet know what to make of it. Renata and Iris arrived the following morning. This visit differed from the hospital. There, Renata had swept through the door with her grief openly expressed and impossible to ignore. Here, in the more composed setting of the Beaumont sitting room, she was subdued, appropriate, and careful. The picture of a stepmother navigating a difficult family moment with sensitivity. She inquired about my recovery. She asked about the investigation in a tone precisely calibrated to sound concerned, without appearing curious. She stayed for 40 minutes and said nothing I could recall afterward. Iris said even less. She occupied the chair closest to the door, which I noted, and surveyed the room with a particular quality of attention. She exhibited no engagement, no interest, but rather an inventory, as if she were cataloging what was present and what was absent. She offered condolences that were grammatically correct and emotionally inert. When Renata stood to leave, Iris rose with her. After they had departed, Joelle sat beside me on the sofa. "I need to tell you something," she began. "I've been trying to figure out when to say it." She had been at the wedding the entire evening. She knew the venue, the layout, and where people had been standing at various points throughout the night. In the final 20 minutes before Cole and I said our goodbyes and got into the car, she had gone outside for air, to the side terrace overlooking the park. Standing at the far end, partially obscured by one of the old oaks, was Iris's phone held tightly to her ear. She was speaking in a voice low enough that Joelle couldn't discern the words, but sharp enough that she could read the posture. Tense. Urgent. The body language of someone desperate for a call to go a certain way. "Did you see who she was talking to?" I asked. "No, she had her back to me." When she heard me approach, she hung up and walked back inside without looking at me. "What time was this?" Joelle pondered. Maybe 15 minutes before you two left? I sat with this information. That evening, I called Iris. I maintained an easy tone. I asked how she was coping, whether she was sleeping, if there was anything she needed. I listened to her responses as Silas had taught me, not for what was said, but for what was arranged around it. Her replies were smooth, almost practiced. She asked the right questions in the right order. Then, near the end of the call, she said, "How is the investigation going? Are they making any progress?" Not, "How are you coping?" or, "Is there anything I can do?" The investigation. That was what she wanted to know about. I told her nothing had been confirmed yet. I kept my voice even. I said goodnight, set the phone down on the kitchen table, and looked across at Joelle, who had been watching my face the entire time. "She asked about the investigation," I said, "not about me." Joelle was quiet for a moment. "What does that mean?" "I don't know yet," I replied, "but I'm going to find out." Beth was in the kitchen doorway clearing a nearby tray. Joelle spoke Iris's name once more, repeating it for clarity, as one does when thinking aloud. And I saw it. Beth's hands stilled. Not a flinch, not a reaction, just a complete, instantaneous pause that lasted no more than 2 seconds before she resumed her task and moved back toward the kitchen without a word. I noted it. I said nothing, but I filed it alongside everything else: the shifting eyes, the changed subjects, the phone call at the edge of the terrace, the question about the investigation that replaced a question about me. The pile was growing heavier. I didn't yet know what it would coalesce into, but I was beginning to understand that the answer to what had happened on Highway 80 wasn't out there somewhere on a distant road, or in a shell company filing, or on a fragment of traffic camera footage. It was in this city. It was in these rooms. It was closer than I had allowed myself to believe. The cameras on Highway 80 didn't yield what we needed easily. They never do. Silas had requested access to the municipal traffic camera footage within hours of arriving in Savannah. What came back was discouraging. The camera positioned closest to the crash site had been operating at reduced capacity that night due to a maintenance issue that had been logged but not yet repaired. This meant the footage from that particular angle was grainy and fragmented, the kind of image where shapes were discernible, but details dissolved into noise the moment one attempted to isolate them. The truck was present. You could discern its mass, its general outline. The license plates were unreadable. He informed us of this on the third morning, sitting at the kitchen table on Bull Street with his laptop open and his expression carefully neutral. I watched him scroll through frame after frame of degraded gray footage and felt the distinct frustration of being very close to something and completely unable to grasp it. "What about the other cameras?" I inquired. "There are intersections all the way back toward the city. If the truck came from downtown, it would have passed at least 4 or 5 of them." Silas looked at me. "That's exactly what I'm working on." It took 2 more days. The municipal cameras at the first 2 intersections west of the crash site had captured the truck passing through, but again, at angles and distances that rendered the plates unreadable. Silas pulled every frame, enhanced what could be enhanced, and encountered the same obstacle each time. The truck had been chosen deliberately, I realized later. An older model lacking the reflective plate coating that newer vehicles possess, on a route where the lighting was at its worst. Whoever had orchestrated this had thoughtfully considered the cameras. On the 5th day, Silas contacted Detective Whitaker. There was a gas station on the western edge of the Highway 80 corridor, a privately owned operation set back from the road at the junction where trucks coming from the industrial sector of Savannah would logically pass on their way east. The station had its own security system, privately maintained, focused on the fuel pumps and the entrance road. Whitaker had to approach the owner directly, badge in hand, to gain access to the footage. The owner was cooperative but slow, and there were 3 hours of waiting while the appropriate individuals made the necessary calls. I spent those 3 hours at the kitchen table, re-examining everything Silas had already shared. The shell company filings, the fragmented camera frames, the incident report from the crash site that Whitaker had quietly provided. I was looking for anything I might have missed the first time around. Mostly, I kept my hands busy to prevent my mind from wandering to darker places. When Whitaker finally called with the gas station footage, Silas drove to the station himself to review it on site. He returned 2 hours later and placed his laptop on the table without a word, turned it toward me, and pressed play. The image was clearer than anything we had seen thus far, though not perfect. The station's cameras were aging, and the timestamp burned into the corner of the frame made the image harder to read, but it was distinct enough. A heavy truck moving slowly past the station entrance, heading east, and in the cab, visible for approximately 4 seconds through the side window as the vehicle turned slightly toward the camera, was a face. Male, middle-aged, a heavy jaw, short hair, a particular way of holding his shoulders that suggested someone accustomed to long hours behind the wheel. Silas had already scoured every available database before he walked back into the room. No matches had come up from the standard searches, and none in any system he had direct access to, which was where his capabilities as a private investigator working alone concluded. However, for Sutton Beaumont, this was merely a starting point. Sutton had spent over 30 years building Beaumont Enterprises, which meant he had 30 years of employee records, contractor files, and personnel documentation stored in archives that his office manager could retrieve with a simple phone call. He made that call while Silas and I were still at the table. 20 minutes later, his assistant sent a folder of scanned records from a logistics contractor the company had used briefly 4 years prior. I opened the folder. I went through the employee photographs one by one, holding each one up against the still frame Silas had captured from the gas station footage. Most were clearly incorrect. Wrong age, wrong build, entirely wrong. I set them aside one by one. I was on the 11th photograph when I paused. I placed it on the table next to the laptop screen and looked between the two images for a long moment without speaking. "Silas," I said. He leaned over, glanced at the photograph, then at the screen. He remained silent for several seconds. The name printed beneath the photograph was Hank Grover. He was 42 years old and a former freight driver employed by the logistics contractor for 14 months before being dismissed following a cargo incident that resulted in a formal dispute with Beaumont Enterprises. According to the file, the dispute had not been resolved to his satisfaction. Furthermore, a note added by the HR manager at the time indicated that he had expressed his feelings about the outcome in terms sufficiently concerning to warrant documentation. He had known the company. Someone had known about him, found him, and utilized him. Silas cross-referenced the name against a current address database and found a rental listing on Wheaton Street, registered 8 months ago, just 12 minutes from where we were sitting. I was already reaching for my jacket. Silas and Whitaker arrived ahead of us. By the time Sutton and I reached Wheaton Street, they were standing in the open doorway of the apartment with the distinct stillness of people who have found what they were looking for, only to discover it had already vanished. The room was empty, stripped in haste, but thoroughly. A bare mattress, open drawers, a coffee mug half-rinsed in the sink that Whitaker noted was still faintly warm. Grover had left within the last few hours. Someone had warned him. I stepped inside without seeking permission. The main room yielded nothing, nor did the kitchen. However, the dresser against the wall caught my attention. 3 drawers hung open in the chaos of a hasty departure, but one, the bottom one, was carefully shut. In a room where everything else had been left mid-action, that single closed drawer felt out of place. I crouched down and pulled it open. It was empty, except that it wasn't. The drawer caught at the back, and as I ran my hand along the interior, I felt it. something flat and rectangular, wedged into the gap between the casing and the back panel. A prepaid phone, its screen cracked, a gas station brand, purchased with cash by someone who wanted to leave no record. I pressed the power button. One contact was saved. No name, just a number. I photographed the screen carefully before handing it to Whitaker. He looked at the image, then at me. "Good eye," he said. I didn't answer. I was thinking about who that number belonged to and why Hank Grover had considered it worth hiding before he fled. I only learned what happened next much later, through testimony, through evidence, through the slow and painful process of reconstructing a night I had not been present for. But I have thought about it enough times that I know how it must have unfolded. I will recount it as I understand it now, from the other side of everything. Brunswick, Georgia sits about an hour south of Savannah on Interstate 95, close enough to feel like part of the same world, yet far enough to disappear into if you move quickly and leave no trail. Hank Grover had moved quickly. He checked into a motel off Highway 17 sometime in the early hours of the morning, paying cash at the front desk for a room at the end of the row, the kind of room that faces the parking lot and has a bolt on the inside of the door that you can throw without a second thought. He would have sat in that room for a while, I think, working through the calculations of his situation. He had done what he had been paid to do. The money had arrived before the job, as it always did in arrangements like this. One clean and untraceable transfer through the intermediary account he used for work. He didn't advertise. But now, the people who had hired him had a problem, and a problem like that could become his problem too, if he wasn't careful. He had seen enough of how these things worked to know that when investigations began, the person at the bottom of the chain was always the first to be handed over. He wasn't going to be handed over. Somewhere in those first hours in that Brunswick motel room, Hank Grover made a decision. He picked up the prepaid phone, not the one we had found in the apartment on Wheaton Street, but its counterpart, the matching device he had kept for precisely this kind of moment, and sent a message to the only number he had for the person who had arranged his payment. The message was short. The number was not $180,000. That was the value of his silence, he had decided. Transferred within 72 hours to an account he would specify, or he would walk into the nearest station and tell them everything he knew, which was considerably more than the people on the other end of that message would be comfortable with. Then he put the phone down and waited. Iris read the message in her bedroom. I know this because she told investigators later, in the flat, composed voice she used for everything, that she had been awake when it came through. That she had not been sleeping well since the wedding, which was the closest she came in any of those sessions to acknowledging that what she had done carried weight. She read the number twice. Then she walked down the hall to her mother's room and showed Renata the screen without saying a word. Renata read it again, placed the phone on the nightstand and pressed both hands flat against the surface of the bed, taking a deep breath. They went to Dorian that same night. It was late, past midnight, when they knocked on his study door. My father had always been a man who kept unusual hours, who did his clearest thinking in the silence after the rest of the house had gone quiet. He would have been at his desk when they entered. He would have looked up from whatever he was doing and read something in their faces before either of them spoke. Renata laid it all out for him. The arrangement she and Iris had made, the money that had moved, the man they had hired, and what he had been hired to do. I don't know exactly how long it took her to say it all, or what my father's face did while she spoke. What I know is that when she finished, he didn't respond immediately. He sat in silence for 2 hours. I have tried to imagine what moved through him during those 2 hours, whether he thought about Cole, about the young man who had known his daughter since childhood, who had loved her with a patience and a steadiness that Dorian himself had never quite managed, Whether he thought about the wedding, about walking Sarah down that aisle with his eyes fixed on some middle distance while his wife and stepdaughter's plan was already in motion around him. Whether he thought about Vera, about the woman he had once loved enough to build a life with, whose daughter was now lying in a hospital bed because of what sat in this room. I don't know what he thought about. I only know what he chose. Renata pressed him eventually. She was practical in the way people are practical when they are afraid, laying out the consequences in clear, sequential order. If the Beaumonts found out about this, the business arrangement that had kept them solvent for the past 3 years would end immediately. The house in Ardsley Park, mortgaged against projections that depended on that arrangement, Renata and Iris's deal, would follow. Everything they had built in the years since Dorian's own finances had quietly begun to fail. Everything Renata had worked to hold together and present as stability would come apart within a month. She didn't have to say the rest of it. The rest of it was obvious. Dorian looked down at his hands on the desk in front of him. I think about those hands sometimes. The same hands that had lifted me out of my crib when I was 3 days old, that had held mine crossing streets when I was small, that had straightened my collar before school photographs. Hands that knew exactly what they were choosing not to do. He made his choice in silence, the way cowards always do. The next morning, his name lit up on my phone just after 9 meals. I answered on the second ring. He asked if I had eaten. He asked if I had slept. He said he was thinking about me and that he would come by later if I was feeling up to a visit. His voice was perfectly steady, warm, measured in the careful way it always was, giving nothing away, asking for nothing in return. I told him I was managing. I told him I would see him later. I didn't know then what the night before had cost him to perform that phone call. I didn't know that while I had been lying awake in the Beaumont guest room, running through camera footage and shell company records and the single saved number on a prepaid phone, my father had been sitting in his study choosing, with full knowledge and clear eyes, to let me drown. I had been watching Bet for days. Not obviously, not the way you watch someone when you want them to know you're watching. The quiet way. The way I had learned to observe things since the night on Highway 80 had taught me that the most important information rarely announces itself. Bet moved through the Beaumont house with her usual efficiency, arriving each morning, working through her routines, leaving in the early afternoon without fanfare. But I had cataloged every moment since the tea things, the stillness of her hands when Joelle said Iris's name, the careful way she had composed herself before turning back to face the room, the small, deliberate nod she had given me before walking away. Bet Sinclair knew something, and she had been carrying it alone for long enough. I chose a Tuesday afternoon when the house was quiet, and Adele had gone to an appointment, and Sutton was on calls in his office. I found Bet in the kitchen, meticulously cleaning the lower cabinets. The kind of task that takes time and keeps the hands busy. I pulled out a chair at the kitchen table, sat down, and didn't pretend I was there for any other reason. Tell me about my mother, I said. Bet looked up from the cabinet. She held my gaze for a moment, reading something in my face, and then she sat back on her heels and was quiet for a little while. What would you like to know? She asked carefully. What the house was like after she passed, I said. What it felt like in those first years. What changed when my father remarried. I kept my voice even and unhurried. I was not asking about Iris. I was not asking about the night of the wedding or the investigation or any of the things that might cause her to close. I was asking about Vera, which was the door I had decided was most likely to open. It worked, but slowly. The way truth usually does when someone has been holding it for a long time. Not all at once, but in increments, each one slightly larger than the last. Bet told me about the year after my mother passed, how the house on Ardsley Park had gone quiet in a way that had nothing to do with noise, a quality of absence that settled into the rooms and didn't lift, How my father had moved through those months like a man fulfilling obligations, doing what was required and nothing more. How I had been 8 years old and had sometimes stood in the doorway of my mother's old study as if I was waiting for something that was never going to come back. She told me that when Renata arrived, things changed. Not badly at first. There was energy again, activity, the sound of someone actively occupying a space, but certain things disappeared. Quietly, without ceremony. My mother's books were boxed and moved to the garage. Her small writing desk was replaced. Her garden in the side yard, the one she had planted herself with sweet olive and Confederate jasmine and a climbing rose she had brought as a cutting from her own mother's house, was dug up and replanted with something low maintenance and generic. And then Bet reached up to the highest shelf of the cabinet she had been cleaning, behind a row of rarely used serving dishes, and brought down a small wooden box. She set it on the table between us. It was about the size of a shoebox, made of dark-stained cedar with a simple brass clasp on the front. Unremarkable to look at. She opened the clasp and turned it toward me without speaking. Inside was a folded silk scarf in pale green, the color my mother had always favored. 3 photographs, loose edges, slightly worn. A small glass bottle of perfume, nearly empty. A handwritten recipe card in Vera's distinctive slanted script, her mother's pound cake, the one she made every Christmas. And at the bottom, beneath everything else, a flat envelope sealed with tape that had yellowed slightly with age. I looked at the box for a long moment without touching anything. Renata told me to throw it away, Bet said quietly. The year after the wedding. She was reorganizing the house. She said there was no reason to hold on to things that no longer served a purpose. She paused. I told her I had taken care of it. She had not taken care of it. She had brought it here instead, to the Beaumont house, and put it on a high shelf behind the serving dishes, where it had waited for however long it took for the right moment to arrive. I reached into the box and picked up one of the photographs. My mother, maybe 30 years old, laughing at something outside the frame. The light was summer light. She looked entirely like herself. I held it for a long time. What brought me back to the room was the sound of Silas's voice from the hallway, measured and deliberate, the way it always was when something had resolved into certainty. He appeared in the kitchen doorway with his laptop under one arm and a printed page in his hand. And he looked between Bet and me with an expression that said he would explain himself as soon as I was ready. I nodded at him to go ahead. He set the printed page on the table. A bank transaction record, formally formatted with account numbers and routing information, and the transfer date printed clearly at the top. The number at the center of the page was $75,000. Silas had traced the prepaid phone number through 3 layers of accounts before the chain resolved. The money had originated in an account registered under the name Renata Harlow. Not a business account. A personal one, opened at a small credit union on the south side of Savannah. From there, it had moved to an intermediary account in Brunswick, Georgia, where it had sat for 4 days before being withdrawn in portions that kept each transaction below the reporting threshold. The transfer had been initiated 3 weeks before the wedding. Sutton came in from the hallway as Silas was finishing. He picked up the printed page and read it through once. Then he read it again. The room was very quiet. He set the page down on the table and looked up slowly. When his eyes found the name at the top of the transfer record, something in his face went absolutely still. Brunswick, he said. I was already on my feet. That's where Hank Grover went. The word hung in the room for exactly 3 seconds before I said what everyone already knew I was going to say. I want to go with them. Silas set his jacket down on the back of the chair. Whitaker, who had come over within the hour after Silas called him with the bank record, looked at me with the measured patience of someone who had navigated this particular conversation before. Before the situation insists on being present for the part where something is finally done about it. I understand why you want to, Whitaker said, but I can't allow it. I had expected this. I had a response prepared. He arranged what happened to my husband, I said. Alongside Silas for 2 weeks. I found the phone in that apartment. I matched the photograph that gave us his name. I have more than earned the right to be in that room when you find him. Whitaker listened to all of it without interrupting, which I respected. Then he explained in the same measured tone that Georgia law was unambiguous on this point. A victim or interested party could not be present at an active arrest and could not be in the room during a formal interrogation. It wasn't a matter of what I had earned or what I deserved. It was a matter of what would hold up in court when this went to trial, which it would, and which required that every step between here and there be done correctly. A defense attorney would need only one procedural irregularity to complicate everything they had built. I knew he was right. I hated that he was right. Then I want your word, I said. Both of you. The moment you're back, you tell me everything. Not a summary. Not what you think I need to hear. Everything. Silas looked at me steadily. You have my word. Whitaker nodded once. That was enough. I watched their cars pull away from Bull Street, and then I went back inside and did the only thing I could think to do with 2 hours and an excess of adrenaline that had nowhere useful to go. I cleared the kitchen table completely and spread everything out across it. My legal pads, 4 of them now filled front and back with notes in my own handwriting, the photograph I had taken of the prepaid phone screen, printed out and annotated in the margins, a timeline I had been building privately since the first night in this house, charting every piece of information we had gathered against the dates it corresponded to, looking for gaps and overlaps, and the places where the shape of things revealed something the individual pieces didn't. I went through all of it again from the beginning. I was looking for what I had missed. There is always something in any investigation that the people closest to it overlook precisely because they are too close. Some detail that sits in plain sight and goes unread because it doesn't match the shape of what you expect to find. I read every page slowly. I checked every date against every other date. I followed every thread back to its origin point and then forward again to wherever it currently ended. By the time Silas's car turned back onto Bull Street, I had been at that table for just over 2 hours, and I had not found what I was looking for, but I had found something else. A small discrepancy in the timeline around the wedding rehearsal dinner. A detail about my father's schedule that week that didn't quite align with what he had told me afterward. I wrote it down in the margin of the 4th legal pad and drew a circle around it and told myself it was probably nothing. Silas came in through the kitchen door. He sat down across from me without taking his jacket off, which told me he wasn't planning to stay long, and he looked at me in a way that said he remembered his promise and intended to keep it. He told me everything. They had found Hank Grover exactly where the motel registration placed him, room 11, end of the row facing the parking lot, bolt thrown on the inside. It had taken Whitaker's badge and a local Brunswick officer to get the motel manager to confirm the registration without tipping anyone off. When they knocked, there was a pause long enough to make Silas wonder if Grover had a secondary exit he had scouted in advance. Then the bolt slid back, and the door opened, and the man standing in the frame looked exactly like someone who had been waiting for this knock since the moment he left Savannah. He did not resist. He came with them quietly, the behavior of a man who had already calculated that cooperation was his best remaining option. At the Savannah Police Department on Habersham Street, with the public defender present and the recording running, Hank Grover did not speak immediately. Silas told me there had been a pause, a long one. Grover sat there with his hands folded on the table, eyes lowered, saying nothing while his attorney spoke for him. There were terms discussed. Conditions, what he was willing to provide, and what he expected in return. Only after negotiating reduced charges in exchange for full cooperation did he begin to talk. He had been approached 4 months before the wedding. The contact had come through a channel connected to his work history, someone who knew about the Beaumont cargo incident, who knew about the dispute that had followed, who knew that he carried a grievance and needed money and had a particular set of skills that could be useful. That someone was Iris Elspeth. The money had come from Renata Harlow, $75,000 through the intermediary account, with the remainder promised on completion. He'd been given the car's details, the likely route, the timing. He'd been told that the job was the car. He confirmed, when Whitaker asked him directly, that he had known there were 2 people inside. He said it without looking up from the table. When Silas finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Iris or Renata? I turned the names over in my mind and felt the full weight of them for the first time, not as suspects in an abstract investigation, but as people I had known my whole life, people who had sat in the front row of my wedding, people who had come to my hospital room and held my hands and said they were sorry. Whitaker had issued a warrant for the Elspeth residence. I sat with that information and let it settle. And then, quietly, underneath everything else, something else began to move. Not a thought, yet not anything I could point to. Just a feeling, a cold and shapeless dread that had my father's name attached to it, though I had no reason yet that I could have written down and shown to anyone. I pulled the 4th legal pad toward me, looked at the circled note in the margin. I didn't know yet what it meant, but I was beginning to wonder. The photograph was small, 8x10, printed on plain office paper, the edges slightly crooked as if whoever printed it had done so in a hurry. Silas set it on the dining room table at the Beaumont house without ceremony, without preamble. He simply placed it down and took a step back. I stared at it. My father's face stared back. He was sitting at a corner table inside a coffee shop I recognized immediately, the one on Abercorn Street, with the dark green awning and the hand-lettered chalkboard menu in the window. I had walked past that place 100 times. I had bought coffee there on my way to see Cole. The chair my father sat in faced the door, the way he always preferred. His hands were wrapped around a ceramic mug. He looked relaxed. Across from him sat a man I did not recognize, a thick-necked man in a gray jacket heavy at the shoulders, a baseball cap pulled low. "Who is that?" I asked, though some part of me already understood. Silas said, "Hank Grover." The room went quiet. 6 weeks before the wedding. Whitaker added, pulling out a second sheet of page from Hank's statement. Grover disclosed the meeting voluntarily once he understood cooperation worked in his favor. He says Renata Harlow arranged the introduction, framed it to your father as a financial consultation, a man who handled certain kinds of sensitive logistics. Dorian Elspeth met with him for 40 minutes. I pressed my fingertip against the photograph, against my father's face. "He knew who Hank was," I said, my voice coming out steadier than I expected. Silas hesitated. "Hank says your father recognized him from a prior Beaumont freight dispute. He knew the man had a record. He didn't ask Renata to explain further, not because he didn't notice, but because he chose not to." "He didn't ask?" I repeated. "No." Adele was sitting across from me. I felt her reach for my hand. I did not pull away, but I also did not feel it. There was a numbness spreading from my sternum outward that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the cold, mechanical understanding of what it meant when a man chose not to ask the right questions. "Is that enough?" I asked. "Is a photograph and a statement enough to—" "It's enough for a warrant," Whitaker said. "But I want more before we move. Grover's statement is valuable, but he's also a man trying to reduce his own sentence. A good defense attorney will hammer that. We need something that doesn't run through him." "Then we find something that doesn't run through him," I said. Silas turned to look at me directly. "Sarah, I know the house," I said. "I know where my father keeps things. I know every room in that house on Ardsley Park. You can't walk in there without a warrant, but I can. He's my father. That still means something legally, doesn't it?" Whitaker and Silas exchanged a look that lasted 2 seconds too long. "You're not law enforcement," Whitaker said carefully. Anything you observe in a private residence as a family member and then report to me voluntarily is a different matter than a search. I understand, I said. I'm going to visit my father. No one stopped me. I drove to the house on Ardsley Park alone. The familiar streets felt wrong in the way that a song sounds wrong when the key is slightly off, everything almost right, and therefore worse for it. The live oaks arched overhead, their Spanish moss stirring in the October wind. The porch light was on. Betty's car was parked at the side. I had called ahead and told Dorian I wanted to see him. He had sounded pleased, relieved even. That relief made something tighten in my chest. He met me at the door. He looked tired in a way he was trying to hide, the careful stillness of a man managing his face. We sat in the living room for 20 minutes. He asked about the Beaumont house, asked whether Adele was taking care of me, asked with apparent sincerity whether Silas had made any progress. I answered each question, watching his hands, watching the way his eyes moved when I said Silas's name. Dorian, I said, and the use of his first name made him blink. Did you ever meet anyone Renata brought into the house? Anyone connected to outside work? A pause, measured, precisely calibrated. Renata knows a lot of people, he said. I don't always keep track. He smiled. I smiled back. I'm going to use the study, I said. I left something here a few months ago, a folder of Vera's paperwork I was going through. The lie came easily, which surprised me. Of course, he said. Take your time. The study smelled the way it always had, old leather and cedar and the faint memory of pipe tobacco from a habit my father gave up before I was born. The bookshelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls, a globe on the corner of the desk that I had spun as a child, a brass desk lamp. The familiar sight of it all made my throat tighten in a way the photograph at the Beaumont house had not. I moved methodically, not quickly. I could not afford to look hurried if he walked in. I checked the surface of the desk first. A date book, a legal pad with notes about a property tax appeal, a pen holder, nothing. I checked the side drawer, utility bills, a checkbook, a restaurant receipt. I checked the center drawer, pens, a stapler, a small calculator. The bottom drawer stuck slightly, the way it always had in humid weather. I eased it open. Manila folders, old contracts, a leather-bound address book so worn the corners had softened into curves. I almost missed it. Tucked beneath the address book, folded once along its center, a small piece of paper, plain white, torn from a notepad, a handwritten phone number in my father's precise, narrow script. I knew that number. I had photographed it in Hank Grover's abandoned apartment on Wheaton Street 2 weeks ago. My hands did not shake. I do not know why. I stood very still for what felt like a long time, looking at the paper, understanding with perfect clarity what it meant. Then I took a photograph with my phone, replaced the paper exactly as I had found it, and closed the drawer. When I turned, Bet was standing in the doorway. She had a folded dish towel in her hands. She was not moving. She looked at me. Then she looked at the desk. Then she looked back at me. She did not say a word, but in her expression, in the grief and relief and sorrow, all tangled together in the lines around her eyes, I read everything I needed to know. She had seen it before. She had known. And she had been waiting for someone to find it. The kitchen on Ardsley Park smelled the same as it always had. Dish soap and dried herbs and something faintly sweet underneath the residue of 20 years of Sunday mornings, of pots left simmering too long, of birthday cakes made from my mother's handwritten recipes on index cards that Bet still kept rubber-banded together in the second drawer from the left. I had eaten breakfast at that table as a child. I had done homework there in the afternoons when the light came through the south-facing window in long yellow rectangles. I had sat there the morning after my mother's funeral and let Bet put a plate of toast in front of me without saying a word. I sat there now, and Bet sat across from me, and the house around us was quiet. She folded her hands on the table the way she always did when she was about to say something she had decided could not be unsaid. I had seen that gesture my whole life. I had never understood until now what it cost her. "I want to start from the beginning," she said, "because it matters that you understand it happened slowly. It wasn't one thing. It was 100 small things, and by the time I understood what I was looking at, I was already in the middle of it." "Tell me," I said, and she did. "It began," she said, "with the money. Not long after Renata settled fully into the house, a year, maybe 14 months after my mother passed, Bet had started noticing the late nights. Renata was not a poor sleeper. She was a deliberate one. The lights in the downstairs office came on after midnight too, sometimes 3 times a week. Not the overhead light, the lamp on the desk, the one with the low wattage bulb that threw a narrow circle of amber across the surface and left the rest of the room in shadow. The kind of light you use when you don't want anyone to know you're working. Bet had her own room off the back hallway. She had never been a heavy sleeper, she noticed. Once, passing the office door on her way to get a glass of water, she had glanced through the gap. Renata was at the computer, leaning close to the screen, one hand on the keyboard and the other holding a piece of paper covered in handwritten figures. She was moving money. Bet did not know how much or where. She only knew the expression on Renata's face. Focused, unhurried, utterly without guilt. And she'd gone back to her room without the water and lain awake until morning. "I told myself it was house accounts," Bet said, "that Dorian had asked her to manage something. I was good at telling myself things like that. I didn't say anything. I let her keep going." The second thing was Iris. Bet had never warmed to Iris the way she had tried to, the way you try out of loyalty to a household to extend goodwill to the people who live inside it. Iris wasn't unkind to Bet, not precisely. Her indifference was akin to that one feels toward furniture. Yet, brief, unguarded moments revealed something else, especially concerning me. "She'd inquire about you," Bet recounted, "not with concern, but with calculation. How often you called, if Cole had visited, what your father had said about the wedding plans." Bet paused. "I told her as little as I could without appearing evasive." "She was keeping tabs," I observed, "always keeping tabs." The third element was the warning. 6 months prior to the wedding, Bet overheard a conversation between Renata and Iris in the sitting room. This time, it wasn't fragments but complete sentences, as she was dusting the hallway shelves, and the door, ajar, went unnoticed. She heard her own name. She heard Renata state, in a tone as even and composed as a recitation, that housekeepers who overheard what they weren't meant to often lost more than their jobs. Bet confessed. "She never looked at me when she said it. She didn't need to." I understood. "You were frightened," I stated. "I was terrified." Bet said it plainly, without apology. "I have a sister in Macon and a nephew starting college. I have things to lose. I want you to understand that I am not a brave person. I've never claimed to be." "But you did something," I responded. "I did one thing," Bet admitted, "because I didn't know what else to do with what I knew." She possessed a small digital recorder, pen-sized, initially intended for household inventory notes. After the warning, she began carrying it in her coat pocket. Not daily, only when something felt amiss. When the late-night lamp illuminated or Iris descended the stairs with a particular stillness, or Renata conducted a hushed phone call with her back to the far wall of the office. She had captured fragments, conversations she didn't fully grasp, a meeting Renata described on a call as having gone smoothly, a reference to Abercorn Street that only now made sense, a number Iris uttered with a tone suggesting relief. 180, followed by silence, then Renata saying, "That's his problem now." She saved everything to a USB drive, which she carried for months sewn into the lining of her coat, in a small interior pocket fashioned with a needle and thread from my mother's old sewing box. I didn't know who to give it to, she explained. I didn't know who to trust. Dorian was... I saw the photograph in the newspaper, the one from the coffee shop. Bet looked at her hands. I knew what it meant. I had known for a long time. I remained perfectly still. Why didn't you go to the police? Because I was afraid of what Renata would do before the police could act. She looked up. And because I needed to know that someone was already close enough to the truth that one more piece would make a difference. The kitchen was hushed. Bet reached into the inside pocket of her apron and placed a small object on the table between us. A USB drive, no larger than her thumb. Its plastic casing was scuffed at one corner from months nestled inside wool lining. Your mother always said the truth deserves to be protected, she said. So I kept it. I gazed at the drive for a moment, then picked it up, stood, and walked to the window where the afternoon light was strongest. My phone was already in my hand. Silas answered on the second ring. I wasn't there when they came for them. Joelle was. She called me the moment they brought them out. Her voice, low and unsteady in a way I'd never heard, struck me. Joelle Prentice had always been the composed one in a crisis, falling apart only afterward. Now she was unraveling in real time, and I sat on the edge of the bed at the Beaumont house, feet flat on the floor, absorbing every word. Joelle had been parked 2 blocks down on Ardsley Park since 5:30 a.m. She hadn't told me she was going. I learned later she'd barely slept, driven over in the dark, and waited in her car with a thermos of coffee and the resolute stubbornness of someone who believes a loved one shouldn't face something alone, even if that person is 40 minutes away and unaware of the companion. The police arrived at 6:04 a.m., 2 unmarked sedans and a uniformed unit. Whitaker led the convoy. They moved silently. No flashing lights, no sirens. The quiet efficiency of those accustomed to such operations, knowing noise is purposeless at 6:00 a.m. when warrants are already signed. Dorian was in the kitchen making coffee when the knock came. Joelle could see the downstairs light through the front window. He opened the door, mug still in hand. He saw Whitaker. He saw the badge. And before Whitaker could speak, before the warrant was produced, before any charges were mentioned, my father set his mug on the entry table with deliberate calm and stated, I want you to know I had no part in this. Whatever my wife has done, she acted alone. I knew nothing. Joelle said she typed it into her phone the moment she heard it through the open window, verbatim. She knew, without knowing why, that it mattered. Renata descended the stairs 2 minutes later. She was dressed. Joelle later recalled that detail most vividly. Renata fully dressed at 6:00 a.m., as if she hadn't slept, or as if a part of her had anticipated this for days and chose to meet it fully attired. She opened the door wider, facing Whitaker without flinching. I'll make a full statement, she declared. I'll cooperate completely. My daughter had no involvement in any of this. She knew nothing. Whitaker responded, Ma'am, I need you to step outside. Renata complied. Iris was the last to appear. Joelle heard her before seeing her. Hurried, uneven footsteps on the stairs. The sound of someone jolted from sleep and still gathering themselves. She reached the doorway in a gray sweatshirt, bare feet, hair loose. The moment she saw the uniforms on the front porch, she froze. What is this? She demanded. Her voice held an edge beyond mere fear, something harder. What are you doing here? Whitaker turned. Iris Elspeth, I have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the incident on Highway 80 on E. No. The word came out flat. Final. No. You have the wrong person. You have nothing. Whatever he told you. She gestured down the street toward the unmarked cars, as if Hank were present among them. He is a liar. He is a man paid to do a job, now trying to save himself by pointing fingers. I have never met him. I don't know what you think you have, but you are wrong. She was skillful at it. I must be honest about that. Even hearing it secondhand through Joelle's account, I recognized her particular talent, the way Iris constructed her denial like a methodical, load-bearing structure, each sentence supporting the next. The indignation felt genuine enough to deceive someone unfamiliar with her. Whitaker held up the warrant, waiting for her to finish. She didn't cease easily. "You cannot do this," she insisted, her voice escalating. "Do you understand who my family is? Do you understand who the Beaumonts are and what they're trying to do? This is targeted. This is deliberate. Someone has constructed this because they want to take what is mine and make it look like justice." She turned to Dorian. Tell them right now." Dorian looked at the floor. "Tell them, Dorian." Her voice broke on his name, not from grief, but from the sudden realization that the support she'd expected would not materialize. "Say something." He remained silent. Renata briefly placed a hand on Iris's arm. Iris shook it off. A uniformed officer stepped forward. Iris stiffened as the handcuffs clicked shut, her jaw tight, eyes burning with something that had moved past anger into a state resembling conviction, as if she truly believed, even then, that she was the victim. They escorted her to the car. At the curb, she paused, turning her head not towards me. She couldn't have known I was listening, but in the direction of Bull Street, towards the house where Cole had grown up, towards the house where I was sitting on the edge of a bed, phone pressed to my ear. Joelle was close enough to overhear. Iris spoke quietly, almost to herself. "It should have been mine. Not the house, not the Beaumont name, not justice. Cole." She meant Cole. Joelle stopped speaking. I sat, phone in hand, as the morning light began to filter through the window, entirely unable to find a single word within me that matched the magnitude of my understanding. The 3 weeks between the arrests and my meeting with Whitaker were the quietest I had experienced since the wedding. Not peaceful, but suspended. The warrants had been executed. The responsible parties were in custody. The legal machinery was grinding slowly, independently of me, leaving me with nothing to do but wait and prepare. 3 weeks is sufficient time to cease crying each morning. It is not enough time to stop asking why. I had spent those 3 weeks constructing something. Not grief, not anger, though both still simmered beneath the surface like water under ice. What I had built was a list. 14 questions meticulously handwritten on a legal pad, revised 4 times over 21 days until every word carried significant weight. I had asked Joelle to read it. She did so silently, then handed it back, remarking only, "You sound like a lawyer." I told her I had learned by observing Norbert Quill. I called Detective Whitaker on a Tuesday morning. I requested a meeting, not an update, a meeting with dedicated time in a private room. He paused briefly before agreeing to Thursday at 2 p.m. I arrived 10 minutes early. The conference room at Savannah PD carried the scent of recycled air and stale coffee. Whitaker was already there. A manila folder open before him on the table. He gestured to the chair opposite him. I sat down, placed my legal pad on the table, and uncapped my pen. He glanced at the pad, then at me. Something in his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. "You've been preparing," he stated. "For 3 weeks," I replied. "Begin wherever you're comfortable. I'll let you know when I have a question." I watched as he mentally shifted from treating me as a victim to acknowledging me as someone who had earned the right to be in that room. He closed the folder, clasped his hands over it, and began. Iris had been questioned in 2 separate sessions, the first within 24 hours of her arrest, the second 4 days later, after her attorney advised partial cooperation in exchange for a more favorable sentencing recommendation. She had not confessed to the operational details, those she delegated to Renata, who had covered them with the thoroughness of someone who had long ago prioritized her daughter's future above her own freedom. But Iris discussed the why. She volunteered it, Whitaker said. We didn't press her on motivation. She brought it up herself about 40 minutes into the first session, as if she needed someone to understand. What did she say? I asked. He opened the folder and read from the transcript, his voice flat and procedural, which paradoxically made it more impactful. Iris had spoken of loving Cole Beaumont even before the betrothal was formally announced, not as a child loves a family friend, but as a woman loves the single individual she has definitively chosen as her destined partner. She had observed the arrangement solidify over years, the quiet discussions between Adele Bancroft and her mother, Vera Voss, the seemingly preordained movement of the two families toward each other. She had told herself it would falter, that Cole would perceive what she saw, that proximity and time would achieve what she couldn't articulate. When the Beaumont family refused her, not once but consistently, subtly, and with a politeness more definitive than any argument, something within her had shifted. She used the word repositioned. Whitaker glanced up from the transcript. She stated her understanding of fairness had been repositioned. I wrote the word down, staring at it. Continue, I said. She had told the investigator that I had been handed everything without striving for it. The name, the connection, the company my mother had built, the man who had grown up beside me, who had made a promise at a grave that was never meant to be mine. She had said this without anger, a detail Whitaker noted in his report as more disturbing than if she had erupted in rage. She stated it as one declares a mathematical certainty. You were given the sum. I was never given the equation. I set my pen down. She actually said that? I asked. Not a question, but a confirmation. Word for word, Whitaker confirmed. I looked at the wall behind him for a moment. High and narrow, a window offered a rectangle of November sky, uniformly gray and utterly indifferent to the scene unfolding in the room. I drew a breath. I had promised myself I would not fall apart in this building, and I kept that promise. But it came at a cost. Did she say anything about wanting the company? I inquired. Vera and company specifically? Whitaker turned a page, then another, his finger tracing the transcript. Not by name, he said slowly, but she said, he located the line. She said that your mother had built something that should have remained in the family, that when a woman like Vera Voss creates something from nothing, those who carry her blood should be the ones to carry it forward. He looked up. Then she stopped. Her attorney placed a hand on her arm. The room fell very quiet. She stopped. I said that because she was about to reveal something that implicated her in another crime. Whitaker met my gaze. He did not confirm or deny it. He didn't need to. Did she mention anything else about an inheritance? I asked. About my mother's estate specifically? Assets? A will? Anything? He flipped to the second session's transcript, scanned it, and stopped. Actually, yes. He turned the folder to face me, pointing to a single highlighted line. She mentioned an inheritance. He read directly. What was left to Sarah was never managed the way Vera intended. I read the line 3 times, then closed my legal pad, capped my pen, and stood. Thank you, detective, I said. You've been thorough. He rose with me. Sarah, whatever you're contemplating right now, I need to see my mother's lawyer, I stated. I drove to Norbert Quill's office on Bull Street without calling ahead. The receptionist looked up from her desk with the practiced, neutral expression of someone accustomed to managing unscheduled arrivals. I need to see Mr. Quill. He's with a client until— I'll wait, I interrupted, however long it takes. I sat in the leather chair by the window, gazing out at the street, contemplating a single line from a transcript within a police folder. What was left to Sarah was never managed the way Vera intended. Until that moment, I hadn't realized how much remained unexamined, how many rooms within my own inheritance I had never opened. I was going to open every one of them. Norbert Quill's receptionist had offered me water twice by the time he emerged from his office. I had declined both times. I wasn't there for hydration. I was there because a woman I perpetually mourned had left something behind that I had been denied access to. And I wasn't leaving that building until I understood precisely what had been taken from me and who had dared to take it. Norbert appeared in the doorway at 4:20. He was a man of deliberate precision, the kind of carefulness honed by years of legal practice, where every expression was a calculated choice and every pause was significant. He looked at me, seated in his waiting room with my legal pad on my lap and my coat still on, and something in his demeanor shifted in a way I hadn't witnessed before, not surprise, but something older. "Sarah," he said, "come in." I placed my legal pad on his desk before sitting. I recounted Iris's words, verbatim. What was left to Sarah was never managed the way Vera intended. I then explained that Iris had fallen silent immediately after uttering this, as if an unseen hand had stifled her. I needed to understand why those particular words had caused her to stop. Norbert was silent for a long time, his hands clasped on the desk, his gaze fixed on them before he met mine. "How much do you know about probate law in Georgia?" he asked. "Tell me what I need to know," I replied. He stood and walked to a low credenza against the far wall, which I had always assumed housed tax records and old client files. He unlocked it with a key from his personal keyring, a smaller, older one retrieved from his inside jacket pocket, not the office keychain on his desk. He pulled out a dark gray document box, sealed with a red archival band, and placed it on the desk between us. I looked at it. "How long has that been in there?" I asked. 20 years, he said. The room was remarkably quiet. "Norbert," my voice was steady, surprisingly so. "What is in that box?" He sat back down, not opening it yet. "Before I show you this," he said carefully, "I need you to understand my position. Your mother was my client. Her instructions to me were specific. The document inside this box was to be held in sealed form until you reached a point where, in my professional judgment, presenting it would serve its intended purpose rather than cause further harm." He paused. "For many years, I determined that the circumstances were not right. Your household was intact. You were a minor, then a young adult still reliant on your father's goodwill for your education and stability. Vera understood that timing was everything." Another pause. "I believe the timing is now appropriate." "Open it," I said. He slid off the archival band and lifted the lid. Inside, a sealed envelope with Vera's handwriting on the front. Beneath it, a set of legal documents clipped together, a notarized inventory sheet, and 2 additional sealed letters, one addressed to Norbert, the other to Sutton Beaumont. Norbert opened the legal documents first. Vera Elspeth Voss had drafted her will 14 months before her passing, while she was still well enough to sign with a steady hand. The will was unambiguous: $2.3 million in personal assets, investment accounts, and company equity held in a dedicated trust. The company, Vera and Cohen, interior design registered on Jones Street, Savannah, Georgia, including its brand, client contacts, intellectual property, and remaining lease agreements. All of it left entirely to her daughter, Sarah Elspeth, to be transferred upon Sarah reaching the age of 25 or earlier at the discretion of the trustee. The trustee named in the document was not Dorian Elspeth. It was Norbert Quill. I read that line twice, then looked up. "He was never the trustee," I stated. "No," Norbert confirmed. "He was not." "Then how?" "Because Vera's will was never contested. Norbert said, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years of something akin to guilt. Your father filed a separate petition for guardianship of your estate as your surviving parent and legal guardian. It was granted routinely. Courts generally defer to surviving parents for minor children. The guardianship gave him control over your personal assets as a minor. It was never meant to extend to the trust, but the trust had not been formally registered in probate at the time of filing because Vera, at my advice, had structured it to avoid probate entirely. He folded his hands again. The problem was that your father's attorney at the time filed documents with the county that conflated the personal guardianship with oversight of the business assets. It was not technically legal, but it was never challenged because no one knew to challenge it except me. And you said nothing, I said. The words landed in the room like a dropped object. I was bound by attorney-client privilege to your mother's instructions, he replied. And then by the judgment call I described. I am aware that is not a sufficient answer. I am giving it to you anyway. I stood and walked to the window. The street below was ordinary. A delivery truck, a couple walking a dog, the late afternoon light turning amber over the rooftops. The ordinary world carried on, oblivious to what was being unraveled in this office. I thought of my father at that kitchen table when I was 8 years old, telling me my mother's company had simply ceased to exist without her. I thought of how completely and naturally I had believed him, without a single question, because he was my father, and fathers do not dismantle the legacies their wives build from nothing and call it grief management. I thought of Renata moving money in the dark with the amber lamp on. I thought of Iris's voice on the transcript. Flat, certain, almost bored, saying, "You were given the sum." My hands were flat on the windowsill. I pressed them down until I could feel the wood grain. Then I turned around. What can be proven? I asked. In a civil case, what is documentable, what is recoverable, and how long will it take? Norbert had anticipated that question. I saw it in the way he was already reaching for a second folder. We worked through it for 2 hours. The documentation was extensive. 20 years of account movements, the original trust instrument, Norbert's own correspondence with Vera in the final months of her life, the county filing that provided Dorian his foothold. The company assets had been systematically liquidated over 11 years. The investment accounts had been absorbed into joint holdings with Renata. The Jones Street lease had been allowed to lapse when the company went dormant, and the building had been sold by a property management firm Dorian part-owned. All of it traceable, none of it legal. I asked questions until I ran out of them. Norbert answered each one. By the time I stood to leave, I had 4 pages of notes and a clarity I had lacked that morning. Sutton was waiting in the parking lot. I hadn't called him. He was simply there, leaning against the hood of his car in the fading light, like a man waiting for something he had long expected. I walked up to him. I held up the photograph Norbert had allowed me to take, a copy of the trust document, Vera's signature at the bottom, dated 14 months before she passed. You knew, I said. It wasn't an accusation, but a recognition. Sutton looked at the document, then at me. His jaw was tight, the way a man's is when he has carried a burden for 2 decades and has finally set it down. Vera came to us, he said, 3 months before she passed. She told Adele and me everything, the will, the trust, Norbert, what she feared Dorian would do once she was gone. She asked us to watch, to make sure the truth reached you when you were ready for it. He paused. When we lost Cole, I understood that the time had come. That everything was connected. Since the day she passed, I said quietly. You've known since the day she passed. Yes. I stood there in the parking lot, my mother's signature in my hand, the sky darkening above the Savannah rooftops, and allowed myself, for just a moment, to feel the full weight of what she had done. She had known she was running out of time. She had built a structure around the truth, placed the people she trusted most at its corners, and told them to hold. They had held. For 20 years, they had held. Then let's finish what she started, I said. Sutton looked at me for a long moment, then nodded once, and we walked to our cars in the dark. 20 years of truth, finally in her hands. But knowing is only half of it. What comes next is the part that cannot be undone. If you're still with me, leave a comment and tell me what you think happens when it all finally reaches a courtroom. Quick note: the story ahead weaves in some fictional elements to tell it fully. If that's not for you, no pressure. If you're staying, let's finish this together. The 6 months between the arrests and the trial were the longest of my life, and strangely, also the most deliberate. I lived at the Beaumont house. I worked at the dining room table every morning, Norbert's files spread across half its length and a legal pad on the other, learning the difference between a criminal proceeding and a civil claim, between what the state could prove and what I would have to prove separately. Adele brought me coffee I sometimes forgot to drink. Sutton sat with me on some evenings and said very little, which was its own kind of sustenance. Joelle drove down from her apartment twice a month and slept on the pull-out sofa, reminding me by her simple presence that there was a life waiting on the other side of all of this, that the world had not contracted permanently to the dimensions of a courtroom. I was, to be honest, not fine. There were nights when the weight of it pressed down with a specificity that general grief never had. Not just the loss of Cole, but the understanding of how many hands had been involved in that loss, how many people who had sat at tables with me and looked me in the eye and known. Those nights I did not sleep. I sat by the window in the room Adele had given me and watched the oaks on Bull Street in the dark, reminding myself with quiet and deliberate intention that falling apart was a luxury I had not yet earned. The trial was set for late summer in the Chatham County Courthouse on Wright Square. I arrived on the first morning 40 minutes early. The courthouse on Wright Square was a building I had passed 100 times without ever seeing it as something that would one day matter to me. That morning, I stood on the steps, looked at its columns and its pale stone face, and understood that this was where 20 years of careful, quiet wrongdoing would either be named or escape naming. There was no middle ground inside those doors. Norbert was beside me. He adjusted his briefcase strap and said, without looking at me, "Whatever happens in there, you have already done the hard part." "The hard part," I said, "is sitting 10 feet from my father for however long this takes." He had no answer for that. Neither did I. The trial moved faster than trials are supposed to move, and Norbert had explained why. 2 defendants, Renata Harlow and Hank Grover, had entered partial guilty pleas in the weeks before proceedings began. Renata's attorney had negotiated cooperation in exchange for a sentencing recommendation. Hank's attorney had done the same more aggressively because Hank had the most to lose and the most to offer. What remained contested were the degrees, the precise weight of each person's involvement, the exact borders of culpability. Those were fought over with the particular intensity of people who understand that the difference between 12 years and 25 is not abstract. The prosecution opened with the financial records, the $75,000 transfer from Renata Harlow's personal account, routed through an intermediary account in Brunswick, Georgia, executed in 4 separate transactions over 2 weeks to stay beneath federal reporting thresholds. Each transaction documented, each routing number traced. Norbert had told me this alone was enough to establish the conspiracy. I sat in the gallery and watched the jury look at the figures on the screen and thought about Renata at her desk with the amber lamp on, moving numbers in the dark while I slept in my childhood bed down the hall. I had thought I was protected. I had thought the house on Ardsley Park was a place where nothing could reach me. I had been wrong about so many things. Hank Grover took the stand on the second day. He was heavier than I had imagined him, broader at the shoulders, with a particular stillness of a man who's decided that his best remaining option is complete and unembellished honesty. He answered every question without elaboration and without deflection. He described the approach Iris had made through their prior connection. He described the meeting on Abercorn Street, my father sitting across from him with a ceramic mug in both hands, being told in language careful enough to be deniable that there was a problem that needed a solution, and choosing not to ask what the solution would look like. He described Renata's wire transfer. He described Highway 80 and the sequence of events that followed, with a flatness that made it worse somehow than if he had been emotional about it. I did not look away from him during his testimony. I needed to understand, not forgive, not excuse, but understand the full shape of what had been set in motion. Every link in the chain. Every person who had made a choice that led to a car on a dark road and headlights in the wrong lane. When he stepped down, the courtroom was very quiet. The USB was presented on the third day. Norbert had spent weeks confirming its admissibility, working with Whitaker's team to establish the chain of custody, confirming that Bette Sinclair had made the recordings within a jurisdiction where single-party consent applied under Georgia law, ensuring the recordings could be authenticated. The defense had challenged it. The challenge had been overruled. The prosecutor played 2 segments. The first was 40 seconds long. Renata's voice, low and precise, speaking on a phone call. She referenced the arrangement, referenced the timing, referenced a number, 180, with the brisk certainty of someone confirming a business agreement. In the background, barely audible, Iris's voice said, "Make sure it's done before the ceremony." The jury did not move. The second segment was longer. Renata and Iris in the sitting room, 3 weeks before the wedding. Iris's voice, sharp and certain, saying that if things proceeded as planned, the Beaumont connection would dissolve, and the assets would need to be managed carefully. Renata said, "Dorian will handle his end." Iris said, "He'd better." I was sitting in the gallery when those words came through the courtroom speakers. I had known, in the abstract, in the documented evidence, legally admissible sense, that my family had planned this. I had known it for months, but there is a difference between knowing a thing and hearing it in someone's actual voice, in their actual cadence, with their actual certainty. Renata sounded like someone planning a catering order. Iris sounded like someone who had been waiting a long time for the pieces to finally move into position. My hands were flat on my thighs. I pressed them down, held them there, and breathed through it, counted through it, the way you breathe through pain that you have decided will not stop you. Joelle, sitting beside me, put her hand over mine. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Dorian took the stand on the 5th day. His attorney had advised cooperation, but Dorian had a different agenda, one that became apparent within the first 15 minutes of his testimony. He acknowledged the meeting on Abercorn Street. He acknowledged recognizing Hank Grover. He acknowledged that Renata had described the situation to him in terms that, in retrospect, were not ambiguous. And then he said that he had trusted his wife's judgment, that he had not understood the full scope of what was being planned, that by the time he understood, events had already progressed beyond his ability to intervene without endangering his family further. It was a well-constructed argument. It might even have worked, except that the prosecution then presented the security footage from the Abercorn Street coffee shop, not just the still photographs Silas had found, but 7 minutes of footage showing Dorian and Hank Grover in conversation. Dorian leaning forward at the 2-minute mark. Hank sliding a piece of paper across the table. Dorian looking at it for a long moment before sliding it back. And then the prosecution read aloud the transcript of Dorian's unprompted statement on the morning of the arrests. "I want you to know I had no part in this. Whatever my wife has done, she acted alone. I knew nothing." The prosecutor looked up from the transcript. "Mr. Elspeth," she said. You volunteered that denial before Detective Whitaker had spoken a single word about charges. Can you explain why an innocent man would feel the need to do that? Dorian looked at his attorney. His attorney looked at the table. The jury looked at Dorian. In the gallery, I looked at my father. This man who had walked me down the aisle at Forsyth Park with his eyes somewhere else entirely, who had sat by hospital windows saying nothing, who had called me the morning after choosing to let me drown and asked if I had eaten enough. And I felt the last thread of something I had been holding on to for 28 years go quietly slack. I did not cry. I had promised myself I would not cry in that building. I kept the promise by understanding with perfect and final clarity that the grief I felt for my father was not for the man sitting in that witness stand. It was for the man I had believed existed. That man had never been real. And you cannot grieve what was never there. The verdicts came on a Thursday. Hank Grover, 30 years, Georgia State Prison. Iris Elspeth, 25 years. She received the sentence without visible reaction, standing straight, chin level. She did not look at me. Renata Harlow, 20 years, in accordance with her cooperation agreement. Dorian Elspeth, 12 years for accessory after the fact and obstruction of justice. I sat with each number as it was read, 30, 25, 20, 12. I had expected to feel something large, relief or satisfaction, or the particular exhaustion of a long thing finally ending. What I felt instead was quieter, something settling, the way a house sounds different after a storm has passed, not restored exactly, but stilled. They brought the defendants out through a side corridor. Dorian passed close to the gallery. He slowed slightly. He turned his head and looked at me, and in his eyes there was something that might have been regret, or might have been the performance of regret. And I understood that I was no longer able to tell the difference, and that this too was something I would have to learn to carry. I looked straight ahead. Outside Wright Square was bright with summer light. The live oaks stood the way they always stood, patient, enormous, indifferent to courtrooms and verdicts and the private calculations of grief. I stood on the courthouse steps and closed my eyes. For the first time since the night on Highway 80, I breathed. A full breath from the bottom of my lungs with nothing held back. My mother had built something from nothing. Someone had tried to bury it. And I was still standing in the summer light, which meant that the work of finishing what she started could now begin. The weeks after the verdict were quiet in a way I hadn't expected. Not empty, just still. Like the city itself had exhaled and forgotten to breathe back in. I stayed at the Beaumont house. Adele made coffee every morning at 7 Hars and left a cup on the counter without asking if I wanted it. Sutton read the paper at the kitchen table and didn't fill the silence with words. I was grateful for both of them in ways I didn't know how to say out loud. One afternoon, Adele sat across from me and told me about Vera. Not the Vera from the documents, not the name on the will or the company filing, the real one. She used to sketch on anything she could find, Adele said. Napkins, the back of envelopes. Once she drew an entire room layout on the inside of a paper grocery bag. She smiled at the table. She said, if an idea was real enough, it didn't need good paper. I hadn't heard that before. I wrote it down after Adele left the room. That evening, she pressed something into my hand, a small brass key, worn smooth at the edges. A piece of white tape on the bow, the ink faded but still readable. Jones Street. She gave it to me the week before she died, Adele said. She told me to keep it until the right person was ready. I closed my hand around it. The next morning, I drove to Jones Street with Joelle and Beth. The building sat between a florist and a narrow alley. The sign above the door was gone. Only the shadow of the letters remained, pressed into the paint like a scar. I put the key in the lock. It turned on the first try. Inside, the air was thick and still. Furniture sat under white sheets. Dust covered everything. the desk, the shelves, the windowsills. But the Vera and Comer logo was still on the wall above the main workspace, painted directly onto the plaster, faded, the edges soft with age, still there. Joelle stood in the doorway and didn't say anything. Beth walked in slowly. She moved to the window and stood with her back to us, looking out at the street below. I watched her shoulders. They didn't move for a long time. "Beth," I said quietly, "did you come here after she died?" She didn't turn around right away. When she did, her eyes were dry, but only just. "Every year," she said. "On her birthday, I brought lavender because she kept a bunch of it on her desk." She paused. I didn't want her to think she'd been forgotten. I looked at the windowsill. There was a small, dried sprig there, pale and brittle. I hadn't noticed it when we walked in. I didn't say anything. I just looked at it for a moment, then moved to the main desk. Before I reached the two original employees, Patricia, who had handled project coordination, and Douglas, who managed client relations, I'd spent 3 days making calls. Norbert gave me the names from Vera's original business filings. Patricia answered on the second ring. Douglas took a day to call back. Both of them said yes before I finished explaining. I found their contact information in Norbert's records and reached out the same week I got the key. They remembered Vera. They remembered the office. Patricia said she had driven past it twice a year for 20 years and never stopped because she hadn't known what to do with what she felt. Now she knew. I pulled open the main desk drawer. Inside, a brown leather sketchbook, the cover warped slightly at the corners from age. I set it on the desk surface and opened it carefully. The early pages showed completed projects, rooms I would never see, but could picture clearly from the drawings, the way light entered a space where a person would naturally want to sit, what a room felt like before furniture ever arrived. Later pages showed ideas that had never been built, precise, careful. A whole unlived vision drawn in blue ink and quiet pencil lines. I turned to the final page, Vera's handwriting. Blue ink, neat and unhurried, like she had known exactly what she wanted to say. "For Sarah, when the time is right." I stood there for a moment. Then I turned to the last few pages again and noticed one was missing, not fallen out, torn, cleanly, close to the spine, like someone had removed it deliberately. I looked at the torn edge for a long time. That evening, I called Norbert. I described what I'd found: the sketchbook, the missing page, the torn edge. He was quiet for longer than felt comfortable. "Norbert," I said, "what was on that page?" Another pause, then, "Come to my office tomorrow morning. Bring the sketchbook." He hung up before I could ask anything else. I set the phone down on the desk and looked around the room. The faded logo, the white sheets, the dried lavender on the windowsill, Beth's quiet years of returning, Vera's unfinished drawings, a page that someone had removed, and a lawyer who wouldn't explain why on the phone. I picked up the sketchbook and held it against my chest. Whatever she left on that page, I was going to find it. Norbert came that evening, as he had promised. He sat across from me at the Beaumont dining table with a folder open between us and told me what the account number meant. My mother had opened it quietly in my name when I was 3 years old, a separate account structured outside the main estate, never included in the assets Dorian had petitioned to control. It had been compounding for over 2 decades, untouched, unknown to anyone except Norbert and the institution that held it. It was enough. More than enough. I would not need to borrow a single dollar from the Beaumont family to finish what my mother started. She had made sure of that long before she ran out of time. I sat with that for a moment. Then I told Norbert to begin the transfer paperwork. The renovation took 6 weeks. I worked alongside the contractors every day, not because I needed to, but because I needed to be inside the process of it, to watch the walls go from gray and dusty to fresh and clean, to see the heart pine floors sanded back to their original warmth, to stand in the space each evening after the crew had gone and feel it becoming something again. Two of Vera's original employees came back. The first was a woman named Patricia, who had been Vera's project coordinator for 4 years before Vera and Coers went dormant. She'd gone on to work for a larger firm uptown, but when I called, she picked up on the second ring and said yes, before I had finished explaining what I was rebuilding. The second was a man named Douglas, who had handled client relations, quite meticulous, the kind of person who remembers every detail of every conversation he has ever had. He arrived for our first meeting with a notebook that contained hand-copied records from the original Vera and Company. Client files he had kept for reasons he described only as, it seemed wrong to throw them away. Adele began making calls through Savannah's social network, the quiet, efficient kind of introduction that moves through certain circles without announcement. Within 3 weeks, we had 4 prospective clients. Within 5, we had confirmed 3. Joelle gave notice at her job on a Tuesday and appeared at Jones Street on Wednesday morning with a laptop and a very strong opinion about the invoicing system. I told her she didn't have to do this. She told me to stop saying things I didn't mean and that I had thought carefully about how to ask. In the end, I did not ask so much as show. I walked her to the desk I had positioned by the east window, the one that caught the morning light best, and I set a key on its surface. Not a housekeeper's key, a full set. Front door, office, storage room. This isn't a cleaning position, I said. I don't know exactly what the title should be, but you are the person in this building I trust most, and I want you here. She looked at the keys for a long moment. Then she picked them up and put them in her pocket and said, I'll need proper business cards. I told her she could design them herself. The new logo went up on the glass door the day before opening. The same medallion as the original, ivory and gold. The letter forms clean and deliberate, but freshly painted at every edge, the way a thing looks when it has been restored rather than replaced. I stood on the sidewalk and looked at it until Joelle came out and stood beside me, and we both looked at it together without speaking. Sutton arrived late that afternoon. He stood outside on the sidewalk with his hands in his coat pockets and looked up at the sign for a long time, long enough that I walked out to stand beside him. He said, without looking away from the sign, Vera would be proud of you, not because of the company. A pause. Because of who you chose to be. I did not answer immediately. I stood beside him in the October air and let the words settle the way good things settle, without rushing them, without diminishing them by responding too quickly. Thank you, I said finally, for holding on to this, for all of it. He nodded once. Then he went inside to say something to Adele, and I stayed on the sidewalk alone for a moment longer. It was Norbert who handed me the envelope, quietly, near the end of the afternoon, while the others were arranging furniture and debating the placement of the front display shelving. He set it on the desk in front of me without explanation. My name on the front in handwriting I did not recognize, and then I looked more carefully and understood it was not unfamiliar, only younger than I had ever seen it. Cole's handwriting before it had fully settled into itself. Adele found it when she was clearing his study, Norbert said. He had asked her to hold it. She felt the time was right. He walked away and left me with it. I turned the envelope over in my hands twice before I opened it. The letter inside was 2 pages handwritten, dated 3 days before our wedding. Cole had known about the pressure Dorian was carrying, the debts, the financial dependence on the Beaumont family name, the way it had distorted every decision Dorian made. He had known, and he had not told me, because he had not wanted me to carry it before the wedding. He had planned to tell me after. He had written down the steps he intended to take, specific, careful, already arranged with Norbert and Sutton to help me reclaim Vera and Colin once we were home from the coast. He had known what my mother had left me. He had been ready to help me reach it. He had only run out of time. I folded the letter carefully and held it for a moment. Outside, I could hear Joelle arguing pleasantly with Douglas about the shelving, Beth's voice low and certain, settling the question. The ordinary sounds of a room becoming a place where work gets done. I put the letter in the inside pocket of my jacket, close. Then I went back to work. Opening day came on a pale winter morning in Savannah. I was at Jones Street by 7 home. The space was ready, had been since the night before, when I stayed alone after everyone left. I set up Vera's photograph on the corner of the desk and spoke to her in the quiet room. I will not write what I said. Some conversations belong only to the two people in them. Joelle arrived at 7:15 with coffee. Beth at 7:30 hung her coat, sat at her desk by the east window without ceremony, as though she had always been there, which in a way she had. Norbert stopped by before the guests arrived and handed me 2 envelopes. The first was from Renata. She did not ask for forgiveness. She wrote that she had loved Dorian with something real, that protecting Iris had begun as instinct before it became a decision, and that there was a point, specific, identifiable, where she had understood what she was doing and chosen to continue. She wrote that Vera Voss was the only woman she'd ever genuinely respected and feared. I folded the letter and placed it in the desk drawer. Some things need no response, only acknowledgement. The second was from Dorian. 1 paragraph, 1 sentence I read 3 times. Your mother's company was the only thing I was ever truly afraid of. I placed it beneath Renata's letter and closed the drawer. He had been afraid of what my mother built because he understood it was stronger than anything he could offer, that it would outlast him. It already had. Guests began arriving at 10 Classon. Adele's network came first. Women who remembered Vera's name, who had watched the firm go quiet and never understood why. They moved through the restored space slowly, the way people move through something they recognize as worth their attention. Sutton and Adele stood in the far corner, watching the room fill. I caught Sutton's eye once. He gave me a single nod. I gave him one back. Then the door opened one more time. An older woman, a Beaufort address on her card. She moved through the room until she reached me, then opened her bag and placed something on the desk between us. A folded piece of paper, its creases gone soft with age, a hand-drawn room layout in pencil, fireplace wall, window seat, measurements in the margin. At the bottom right corner, a signature I would have known anywhere, Vera Voss. She designed my sitting room, the woman said. Her very first commission. We never finished the window seat. She got ill before we could. I drove down from Beaufort this morning. She looked at me steadily. I thought perhaps the time had come to finish it. I looked at my mother's drawing. Yes, I said. I think it has. That afternoon, I drove to Forsyth Park alone. I had not been back since the wedding night. The fountain ran steady in the cold air. I walked to it the long way through the live oaks and stopped where Cole and I had taken our wedding photographs, the ones where he made me laugh just before the shutter opened. I placed a small flower on the stone ledge. I kept my promise, Cole. And I kept yours too. I have thought about what I would say if someone asked what I learned. The deepest betrayal does not come from enemies. It comes from the people seated at your table, the ones who know the specific shape of your trust and choose to use it against you. That kind of loss doesn't have an end.